We're going to unravel the layers of faith woven throughout history. Have you ever used a Webster's dictionary? Do you know who Webster was? We're going to learn about the man Noah Webster and some of the very important things that he put not only into his dictionary but into the other writings. Noah Webster.
Here is the question of the day, which will be answered at the end of today's program. Did Washington pray at Valley Forge?
The information we're discussing is in the book, Who is the King in America? And Who are the Counselors to the King? It's an overview of 6,000 years of world history and why America is unique. Well, Noah Webster, we've all used a Webster's dictionary, and he was one who was a soldier during the Revolutionary War, and then he was in the Massachusetts legislature and the Connecticut legislature, and then he wrote school books. One of them was called the Blueback Speller, and it was the very beginning books that would be used in school to teach kids, but he would have moral lessons. And the Blueback Speller sold 100 million copies. Could you imagine writing a book that sells 100 million copies? And it became the book in the school, the public school system in America. And so Noah Webster really understood that for us to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people need to be educated. They need to be responsible. They need to know how to behave and how to run society. It's no different than if you were to have someone be in charge of running a country or a company and they didn't know anything. What's this person doing running a company? He doesn't know anything. Well, if you get somebody that's educated and they know it, well then, okay, we can trust them. And so in America, we the people are in charge. We are the king. And so we need to be educated. That was the attitude that the founding fathers had, including Noah Webster. And so Noah Webster, one of the things he wrote was this: society requires that the education of youth should be watched with the most scrupulous attention. Education, in a great measure, forms the moral characters of men, and morals are the basis of government. Sort of interesting to say, well, there's, you can't institute morality or whatever. Well, all the laws are as a reflection of the order in society and the idea of the more internal restraints the populace has, the less external restraints they need. We know that if you've ever had a pet dog, if the dog has internal restraints and only goes to the bathroom when it's outside, it can have freedom. It can run around the house. It can jump on your bed. It can be anywhere. But if this dog does not have internal self-control and begins to go everywhere, it's going to be a terrible mess and a lot of yelling at the dog until finally the dog is going to be relegated to living outside or being limited to what rooms of the house it can go into. Its freedoms are taken away because it doesn't have the internal restraints. It's the same way with a parent giving the teenager the car keys and says, teenager, you can come home whenever you want because I know you have internal moral restraints. You're going to do what's right. But if you don't do what's right and drink and drive and party and hang around the wrong kids, you're going to be pulled over by the police and thrown in jail. And you're going to be controlled from the outside, behind bars. You will lose your freedoms. In other words, teenager, you're going to be controlled either voluntarily from the inside or forcibly from the outside. It's the same way with a nation. We're either going to be voluntarily controlled with the people having internal morals, or we're going to get rid of these morals and tell people to give in to their passions and lusts, and everyone does what's right in their own eyes, turns into chaos, and then we're going to say we need some leader to come along with enough power to restore order, and guess what? All the freedoms disappear. Well, Noah Webster continued. He said, education should therefore be the first care of a legislature, for it is much easier to introduce and establish an effectual system for preserving morals than to correct by penal statutes the ill effect of a bad system. In other words, you see students that commit suicide, and we never ask ourselves the question, what are these students being taught? They're not taught that their life is special, that they're made in the image of God, that God has a special plan for each of them. They're taught evolution, that, hey, you came out of the swamp and, it has this sort of a pointless purpose for their life. And people need a reason. I love George Washington Carver, the African-American scientist that developed uses for the peanut. And he said, human need is really a great spiritual vacuum that God seeks to fill. With one hand in the hand of a fellow man in need and the other in the hand of Christ, he could get across the vacuum, and I became an agent. Thus the passage, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, came to have real meaning. Carver goes on to say, as I worked on projects which fulfilled a real human need, forces were working through me that amazed me. I would go to sleep at night with an insoluble problem. When I awoke, the answer was there. He goes on to say, why then should we who believe in Christ be so surprised at what God can do with a willing man in a laboratory? But it's this idea that, hey, your purpose in life is to meet the needs and help people. And so you wonder what is being taught in the schools. Noah Webster continued. He says, the goodness of a heart is of infinitely more consequence to society than an elegance of manners. What's that? Now, that's the old adage, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. In other words, you can train. I was years ago talking with Chuck Colson. He's since passed away. And Chuck Colson was talking about Harvard and their ethics departments at Harvard. And he says it was so ironic that they got to the place they could not tell people what is right and what is wrong. And we can't tell you that stealing is wrong because maybe in your situation it might be okay, and we can't tell you that this is right and this is wrong. And so in their ethics department couldn't tell them what was ethical. And so he said that they basically were just training really intelligent thieves. That we can teach you all this knowledge, but we can't teach you what to do with it. I was talking to a scientist one time, and it was during the debate over embryonic stem cell research, where they take a human embryo and take out the DNA, and then they put in some other DNA and to see if it grows and so forth, make it into different body parts. And he says, science can tell you what you can do, only morals can tell you what you should do. And so at some point in time, we need to have morals, we need to have values. Otherwise, you're going to have Dr. Moreau with the different novels, Jekyll and Hyde. You're going to have using science to do wicked things. Anyway, back to Noah Webster. So he says that the education teaches us the elegance of manners. He says, nor will any superficial accomplishments repair the want or lack of principle in the mind. The education of youth lays the foundation upon which both law and the gospel rest for success. Noah Webster. Another one of his admonitions is, he says, to give children a good education in manners, arts, and science is important. To give them a religious education is indispensable. And an immense responsibility rests on parents and guardians who neglect these duties. So again, it's one thing teaching them how to dress, a skill so they can support themselves, a trade. You can teach them all that kind of stuff, but unless you can teach them religious values, what is right and what is wrong, then they can just use those other things for either good purposes or evil purposes, right? You think of commerce. What's wrong with selling things? Well, that's good. I like commerce. I like being able to have businesses. Well, can you sell prostitutes? Can you sell people into slavery? Can you sell drugs? Like, oh, wait a second. We need to have a moral restraint on what you can and cannot sell. So it's not just learning how to sell things. it's, again, having the religious values of what you can and cannot do. Noah Webster wrote this: practical truths in religion, in morals, in all civil and social concerns ought to be among the first and most prominent objects of instruction. Without religious and moral principles deeply impressed on the mind and controlling the whole conduct, science and literature will not make men what the laws of God require them to be. Let me just pause there for a moment. There's an interesting quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and he said, science in the hands of Christian charity is a dream worth dreaming. But he goes on to say, science in the hands of paganism is a nightmare beyond imagining. And then that was Theodore Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt makes similar statements regarding Nazism. And here at the Nuremberg trials, what's that? That's after World War II is over, and they've captured a bunch of the generals that were under Hitler, and they're having trials. And these generals were saying, we just did whatever he told us to do. This is our country. He was the head of the country. He was establishing the laws, and he was telling us what's right and what's wrong, and we were just obeying our government. Every country, you have to obey your government, right? You obey your government, we obey our government. Our government just said that Jews are not equal citizens and that it's okay to kill them and burn them in gas chambers. And so at the trial, they were trying to find out how can we condemn them for just following the laws of their country, for just following the laws of their leader. They had to come to grips that there's a higher law that supersedes man's law. It's the law of God. And we saw this in the Vietnam era. There was what they call the My Lai massacre. And there was a village in Vietnam, and there was an American soldier, and his commanding officer said, clear the village of the communists, but also clear the people that could be harboring the communists, and maybe the ones that are communists pretending to be civilians. Anyway, this soldier, obeying orders, massacres the whole town. And word of it came back to America, and they have a big trial. And he says, I was just obeying orders. And they finally convicted him because they had to realize, well, wait a second. You have to, in our society, you have to not obey everything the government tells you to do. You have to have an internal compass, an internal moral of what is right and wrong. And you can only get that from God. Another one is a quote from Gerald Ford. And he took over after Nixon. And when Nixon was never impeached, he resigned. Under the threat of impeachment, he simply voluntarily resigned. Anyway, the next president was Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford says that we obey the Constitution, and he says only the laws of God which govern our conscience are superior to the Constitution. So here's Gerald Ford saying there's something higher than the Constitution. It's the laws of God. I love reading through some of the early colonial documents, and I have them in my books. But one of them was in Connecticut. And in 1639, they have their Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. This was their government for the colony of Connecticut. They actually used it up until 1818. And in this Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, it talks about following the laws, and it goes on to say, and if there is a situation and we don't have a particular law to address that situation, just follow the Word of God. How do you like that? Imagine a law today saying, okay, you have to follow this law, and if there's a question and we don't have a particular law, just follow the Bible. That was their attitude back then. Well, Noah Webster, finishing this particular quote, he talks about there's the knowledge on how to have manners and how to have a job and how to do this, but there's also the religious instruction. And so Noah Webster says, and without both kinds of knowledge, citizens cannot enjoy the blessings which they seek. So in the school system, it's not just teaching them a skill so they can get a job and live the rest of their life. No, you want to teach them morals and values, that there's this God that you're accountable to. And the best time to teach them is young, before that clay hardens, before that cement hardens, and before they get stuck in the neurotransmitters, the ways of thinking in their brain. And we'll be back for some more. Again, we've been talking about the book, Who is the King in America? Did you know that Johannes Gutenberg, that invented the printing press, had to borrow money to do it? And he did, and he printed the very first books, and then he didn't sell enough, and the person he borrowed money from took the printing press away, and he had to go into legal battles with that. Well, Noah Webster spent 26 years writing his dictionary, and he had to borrow money to print it. And it was an enormous undertaking of a very big, thick book. Well, guess what? It didn't sell enough fast enough that he had the copyrights fall into the hands of the people that he owed money to. And eventually it turned into the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And so, under new management over the years, they would re-edit it. And they would edit out references to faith. And so now the dictionary has very little references to the Christian faith that Noah Webster had. But if you go back and read the original 1828 Noah Webster dictionary, you will see scripture verses almost in every definition. Well, Noah Webster wrote in his book on the education of youth in America. It was printed in Webster's American Magazine, 1788. In some countries, the common people are not permitted to read the Bible at all. In ours, it is as common as a newspaper, and in schools is read with nearly the same degree of respect. Select passages of Scripture may be read in schools to great advantage. My wish is not to see the Bible excluded from school, but to see it used as a system of religion and morality. Wow, that was the writer Noah Webster of the Webster's Dictionary. The information we're talking about is in the book, Who is the King in America? And the 6,000 years of world history and why America is unique. Well, did you know the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, they had a school code and other laws relating to public schools? It was compiled by Nathaniel C. Schaefer, superintendent of the public school system, and this was in 1915. And it says this, Article 1, the Holy Bible to be read in the public schools. So again, 1915, that at least 10 verses from the Holy Bible shall be read or caused to be read without comment at the opening of each and every school day by the teacher in charge, provided that where any teacher has other teachers under and subject to direction, then the teacher exercising this authority shall read the Holy Bible or cause it to be read as herein directed. That if any school teacher, whose duty it shall be to read the Holy Bible or cause it to be read and directed in this act, shall fail or omit to do so, said school teacher shall, upon charges preferred for such failure or omission, and proof of the same before the governing board of the school district, may be discharged. Could you imagine that? 1915 in Pennsylvania, the teacher had to read 10 verses of the Bible every day without comment, and if they didn't read it, they were fired. Wow, how we have changed in 100 years. Well, the Dallas public school system published a course, and it was called the Bible Study Course New Testament. It was in bulletin number 170, printed by the Dallas Public School Print Shop in what year? 1946. This is the year after World War II ended. And so, printed by the Dallas Public School System, 1946, it says this, forward, the Dallas Public Schools allowed 1/2 credit toward high school graduation for the successful completion of a general survey course in the Bible, given in churches and Sunday schools of the city. Goes on, In 1939, it was decided to provide special courses in Old and New Testament, each course carrying 1/2 unit of credit towards high school graduation. E.B. Comstock, assistant superintendent in charge of high schools. Well, it goes on. Introduction, regulatory rules governing the New Testament study course. Says 1, classes may be organized by any Sunday school or church or any other religious organization for the purposes of studying the Bible in their respective organizations with a view of obtaining high school credit. Successful completion of the course gives 1/2 unit credit toward high school graduation. Imagine today with the teaching of Islam in the schools or in the secular religion. And it's actually the U.S. Supreme Court that called secular humanism a religion. And so back in 1946 in Dallas, they were giving high school credit for studying the Bible. Goes on to say in this course, number 2, an application blank giving necessary information about the class must be filled out and filled by the assistant superintendent in charge of Dallas high schools. 3, there must be a minimum of 40 class periods for 90 net minutes each teaching time, or 60-minute periods net time, or 8 45-minute periods net time. In no case will fewer than 40 different class sessions be accepted. Goes on, number 4, the text used in the New Testament study course, a syllabus published by the authority of the Dallas Board of Education for use in Bible study credit classes. And then other quotes from this course says minimum requirements, New Testament. The course is itself a minimum course since teachers are expected to supplement rather than subtract from the topics included. Dallas Public High School listed for the following summary requirements for the purpose of emphasis and review. 1, ability to name and classify the books of the Bible, common classifications. 2, general knowledge of the New Testament as outlined in the course of study. Reading the entire New Testament is required. 3, ability to reproduce the memory passages indicated in connection with the lessons and given in full in the appendix. Goes on. The appendix required memory verses for review purposes. Pupils should be able to reproduce from memory each of the following quotations when given the accompanying lead, the book, chapter, and verse reference. And then it goes on to say, lesson 1, the pre-existence of Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. That was John 1:1-3, and 1:14. Anyway, this is a required memory verse in the Dallas Public School System high school credit class in 1946. Lesson 2, this is a memory verse, Jesus to the devil in the wilderness. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. It is written again, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. Matthew 4, 7, and 10. Imagine that in a public school system. Lesson 3, the purpose of Christ's coming. Quote, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. John 3:16. So that was a sample of just in 1946, our public school system was not teaching sex and drugs and fluid sexuality and LGBT and Islam and taking kids on field trips to mosques. No, they were teaching Bible verses and having the kids memorize them. 1946. Well, Noah Webster, in his advice to youth, included in his History of the United States, 1932, Noah Webster wrote a number of different quotes that we're going to come back to in just a moment. But I want to have this book, Who is the King in America, one that you consider getting, because it goes through the importance of America. The people are the king. And in order for us to rule, we need to have an educated and moral populace. We'll be right back.
Here is the answer to today's question. Did Washington pray at Valley Forge? In the freezing winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, soldiers died at the rate of 12 per day. Washington wrote, quote, to see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes, by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet," unquote. Quaker farmer Isaac Potts reported seeing in the woods, quote, "the commander-in-chief on his knees in the act of devotion to the ruler of the universe," unquote. From his headquarters at Valley Forge, General Washington ordered April 12, 1778, quote, "Congress having thought to recommend a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, that at one time and with one voice the righteous dispensations of Providence may be acknowledged, and his goodness and mercy towards our arms supplicated and implored. The General directs that the day shall be most religiously observed in the army, that no work shall be done thereon, and that the several chaplains do prepare discourses suitable to the occasion," unquote.
Noah Webster said, "The brief exposition of the Constitution of the United States will unfold to young persons the principles of Republican government, that the general source of correct Republican principles is the Bible." Now, I mentioned that word Republican. A republic is where the people are king, ruling through their representatives. And so the REP in Republican is the same REP for representative. So in other words, in a Republican form of government, you are the king and the representatives are your servants. We pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. We're not pledging allegiance to a king's crest. It's a flag with 50 stars representing the 50 states, representing the people within the states. In other words, when you pledge allegiance to the flag, you're pledging allegiance to you being in charge. When somebody does not pledge allegiance to the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I want somebody else to rule my life. Okay, anyway, so here's Noah Webster says, source for Republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion. Republican government loses half its value where the moral and social duties are imperfectly understood or negligently practiced. And Noah Webster ended, to exterminate our popular vices is a work of far more importance to the character and happiness of our citizens than any other improvements in our education system. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this examination of Noah Webster and some of the information that's in the book, Who is the King in America? And I want to invite you to visit the website tct.tv. tct.tv. You can watch this program again, as well as many other great programs. But while you're there, you can also give a gift. And your contributions, large or small, help Faith and History stay on the air. And I want to thank you in advance for your generosity. God bless you.
This has been a TCT Network exclusive production. If you would like to see more exclusive special programs, send your support to TCT, P.O. Box 1010, Marion, Illinois, 62959.